Hey, it's Brett, and this is the first part of Assata's Escape as Disencarceral Practice by Professor Sam C. Tenorio. Abstract. Often, carceral studies tend to focus on the prison as a mode of stationary confinement, sometimes forgetting that its rationales and practices are based crucially in movement. This is especially true for black populations disproportionately affected by mass incarceration and intentionally disoriented to the causes and manifestations of the oscillation to which they are reduced. This article is concerned with the carceral landscape that emerges in the criminalization of black people and politics through the legal concept of vagrancy, and how, in turn, black surreptitious movement is used to contest incarceration. To do so, it argues that vagrancy paraphrases a suppression of black political practice, focusing on political prisoner Assata Shakur's transnational escape to Cuba and its discursive omission in her autobiography. In tracing the transience of Shakur, the article forwards vagrancy as an elaboration of how anti-blackness materializes via carceral geographies by way of displacement, disorientation, and forced movement. It presents a reformulation of Shakur's escape as disencarceration, which takes seriously the flight toward black liberation as one that is still meaningfully incomplete, elaborating the significance of continual absconding from the field of representation that has been controlled and constituted by discursive and material hegemonies of race. "What's going on?" I asked. "You're being moved." "Where am I being moved to?" "You'll find out when you get there." Assata Shakur. The judge denies our motion for a postponement. The judge denies all our motions. I want to scream. Assata Shakur. One must see what is not there, feel the trace of a form of power that cannot be named, and as Shakur demonstrates, remember what was never written down. Stephen Dillon. Prisons have long been characterized as spaces that lack movement, with images of hard steel and concrete evincing a carceral condition of stagnation. However, while the prison rests on stationary confinement, the rationales and practices used to maintain security and order can be said to be based crucially in movement. This is especially true for black populations who have been disproportionately affected by mass incarceration, punished for mobility, and punished with mobility, reduced to a state of oscillation, often disoriented to its causes and manifestations. This article is concerned with the carceral landscape that emerges in the criminalization of black people and black politics through the legal concept of vagrancy, and how, in turn, black surreptitious movement is used to contest practices and spaces of incarceration. For the former, I argue that the policing of movement is racialized and that vagrancy has always paraphrases the suppression of black political practice. Toward the latter, I focus on a black political prisoner, Assata Shakur's 2001, originally written in 1987, transnational escape from incarceration in New York to exile in Cuba, and its discursive omission in her autobiography, in tracing the peripatetics of Assata Shakur within and beyond the scope of her autobiography. We encounter vagrancy as an elaboration of how and beyond this, how anti-blackness materializes via carceral geographies by way of displacement, disorientation, and forced movement, illustrating her surreptitious movement's tension with these carceral forces. We can begin to elucidate its black anarchist inflection while keeping attuned to the political interval that remains shaped by carceral conditions in which her practice resides. By black anarchist inflection, I am referring to her embodied practice as a rejection in totality of colonial racial authority materially and ideologically embodied in the prison institution. To keep both this inflection and interval in view, I present a reformulation of Shakur's escape as disencarceration, which aims to take seriously the flight toward black liberation as one that is still meaningfully and incomplete, elaborating the significance of a continual absconding from the field of representation that has been controlled and constituted by discursive and material hegemonies of race. Shakur's political practice, both literal and textual, demonstrates a movement that must perpetually press against the carceral conditioning of the West. Incomplete and iterative, her practice elaborates an insurgent transience that contests and at the same time incites the West reterritorialization of carceral geographies. The transient tactics of the incarcerated reveal a generative site for further study into the meaning of black politics, and in particular, the meaning of disencarceration as one modality of black political non-participation. Vagrancy, criminalization. Assata Shakur, a former member of the Black Liberation Army, was convicted in 1977 for the killing of a state trooper during a 1973 shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike. She was arrested and later found guilty of first-degree murder for aiding and abetting. During this time, she was shuffled throughout the U.S. penal system, though she spent the majority of her incarceration in solidarity confinement. On 2nd of November 1979, Shakur broke out of Clinton Correctional in New York with the help of 3 members of the BLA. Shakur was then stamped a fugitive and subsequently fled to Cuba 5 years later, seeking and acquiring political asylum in 1984. In 2005, she was classified as a domestic terrorist by the FBI, and a bounty of $1 million was placed on her head. In 2013, the FBI named her a most wanted terrorist, the first woman to be given such a designation. Her bounty was then doubled to $2 million, and overnight, billboards were raised in New Jersey to advertise these developments. Since she has been in Cuba, the U.S. government has made numerous attempts to extradite her, with Donald Trump's most recent public demand for the return of the cop killer coming in June of 2017. Her asylum, while always uncertain, is now made even more precarious as official relations between Cuba and the United States develop. In her autobiography, Assata Shakur constantly and consistently refers to her forced movement. This article's first epigraph is a common refrain throughout her text chapters, an exchange between prison guard and inmate that bespeaks Shakur's constant disorientation concerning where she may be going next. The second references motion's double meaning, both as a technical term of jurisprudence and as a denial of personhood. Together, the excerpts clarify how movement frames Assata Shakur's story as she navigates her experience in the prison, as we shift back and forth from her present incarceration to her life before it, as we pass from her time in the United States to her current exile in Cuba. We move across the prison, we move across time, we move across borders. What becomes increasingly apparent throughout the autobiography is not simply her motion, but that motion itself, that is, the motion itself, but that she is always moving or being moved, and that until Cuba, she is never still, and even in Cuba, she is never free. That her abrupt transfers between jails without any word to her lawyer or explanation was a scenario that would be repeated over and over again writes Shakur. In his book, Slaves of the State, Dennis Childs explains development of the prison through the evolution of carcerality, of black life. To do so, he proposes the middle passage carceral model. With it, he shifts the historiography of the prison past the centering of a white subject and locates slavery's architectures in the center of European imperialism as he traces the advancement of the chain gang to the penitentiary. It is both notable and important that his reference to chattel slavery as an origin of the prison calls out the middle passage. As Childs docks the slave ship alongside the prison, he brings necessary attention to their material and conceptual links. Nowhere else is the purpose of the slave ship so directly repurposed and repursued as it is in the prison, both serving a necrotic function directly targeting black populations. Within this, these geographies exist in part to keep the rebellious and dissenting under the control of white authority. For the slave ship, slaves who were found or were suspected of dissenting were policed through shackling, separation, nettings, and gratuitous punishments. In the case of the prison, black political prisoners like Shakur, Angela Davis, and notably George Jackson have argued, its primary function was at once to serve, quote, as a surrogate solution to the social problems associated with poverty and racism, end quote, and to repress social dissidents. Davis and Rodriguez, 2000. As Childs, 2015a, places the hold and the cell in vibrating tension with one another, he also draws attention to the cyclical temporality of black life, the simultaneity of ship and prison holds wherein past, present, and future exist in constant interface. The cycle is itself a movement bearing a different conception of time, one that not only indicates the recurrence of carceral geographies, constantly evolving but persisting, but also underscores the temporality of the hold's imprisonment itself. Regimented and repetitious, time for the entombed and incarcerated is intimately linked to the carcerality of space. For Michael Hard, in 1997, punishment is time, and in the prison, this translates not only to how much time is spent in prison, but how one's time is spent in prison, as a series of schedules and sequence of routines. Time discipline emerges in the prison through the destruction of temporal autonomy and the execution of daily timetables. Prison is a space-time, where the discipline of space and time happens simultaneously, where the incarcerated are scheduled where to be and when to be there, and where the space and time the prison should equally produce the position of the prisoner. It is the movement that matters of time and space converge. Time is measured by how we move across space. On the slave ship, like in the prison, time was carefully and purposefully controlled. Time in the hold, time on deck, time for feeding, time for cleaning, time to destination, time to everywhere, time to nowhere. Time was rarely, if ever, the time of the enslaved. Likewise, in the prison, the incarcerated have very little control over their time. Time in the cell, time in the yard, time of a sentence, time everywhere, time nowhere. Prisoners and the enslaved aboard the slave ship lose track of time, consistently disoriented, constantly moved. Together, these Western spatialities illustrate how black populations affected by the logistics and mechanisms of enslavement have been marked by the loss of history, an absence of time, captivity in space, and burdened by mobility. In its time-space, prison produces and relies on the perpetual cycling of its prisoners. The incarcerated are shuffled between prisons, within the prison, and from the prison to the outside and back again in cycles of recidivism. Black populations have bared the brunt of this burden of vagrant mobility. Historically, the expansive carceral state in the United States has hinged on a criminalization of blackness intimately tied to matters of locomotion, including idleness, itinerancy, and homelessness. This is directly reflected in the slave codes, the post-emancipation black codes, segregation laws, as well as the enforcement of contemporary loitering laws and homelessness ordinances. Under colonial racial authority, black people have always been made to move, and their movements have been materially coerced and ideologically fabricated. Shakur's seemingly lifelong movement enunciates a vagrancy that etches black life in the United States as a process of criminalization and a condition of black criminality. The term vagrant refers somewhat innocuously to a person who wanders or roams, one who is not fixed or settled but is constantly moving with no permanent home, or to unpredictable movement and behavior. The term evokes a more prejudicial tone in its definition as a person who lives by begging, or, as per its use relative to the law, relating to or living the life of a vagrant. Given the West's political orientation toward poverty, the seemingly insipid definition confesses a deleterious signification, especially as it renders meaning for a status of life. Here, vagrant is politically and legally stressed, connoting obvious class hierarchies that hinge on ownership, employment, and domicile, and imply their proper environments. The term vagrant also marks and is marked by race, especially in the United States, where post-emancipation black codes were passed in southern states to restrict the lives of free black populations, and whose defining feature was a broadly defined and broadly enforced vagrancy law. Under the black codes of 1865 and 1866, authorities would arrest free black people for minor infractions and subsequently have them committed to involuntary labor under what came to be known as convict lease system. Through the codes, the use of vagrancy was integral to the transition from chattel slavery to more clandestine forms of racialized incarceration. In other words, policing movement was often the way in which free blacks were returned to a condition of servitude at the command of whites. Vagrancy laws were thus directly tied to the criminalization of blackness and black freedom, where vagrancy has been used as an almost catch-all to catch all blacks in the act of doing or doing nothing, and ultimately the act of moving. As such, vagrancy was always already the enunciation of black movement. In its legal uses, vagrancy presumes that one is moving between or among coherent places that provide substantive and subjective meaning, either the place of residence, the place of employment, or the place of consumerism. To be charged a vagrant is to be marked as interstitial, being in between places, and thus to be nowhere that is valued in the eye of the state. However, rather than reflecting an absence of meaning, to be the interstitial vagrant is to be inundated with meaning. It is to be excessively known in relation to one's movement, ordering and gathering one into a position of criminal no matter one's movement as well as because of one's movement. Vagrancy serves as both a dispossession and an enunciation of dispossession that fails to be recognized as such. The charge of vagrancy names a collection of threats against property and order and racially categorizes a problem population of potential threat. That is, the vagrant announces Du Bois' question of being a problem to be solved as well as a threat to be contained, the threat of rebellion and a threat to property and the security of recognized political subjects. By calling out the danger of the threat, vagrancy encompasses a futurity, where neither the criminal act or even criminal intent are required. It is simply the possibility of the criminal that is criminal. It is concerned with an unknowable future that is understood as knowable and guaranteed. The charge of vagrancy charges that the next move is known. In the United States, while the methods and systems of chattel slavery are not identical to the new carceral manifestations that come in its wake, their visual rhyme is bridged, at least in one way, by their foundational concern with regulating and coercing movement of black people. Here, vagrancy is forwarded to bring theoretical attention to the way in which the expansion of carceral geographies hinges on the spatial dislocations and discursive circulation of black people and the fabrication of the black criminal. In this way, while vagrancy is something that is applied to black people, it is also how they are forced to move. Vagrancy is not just a charge. It is the form of movement that is produced through the postbellum geography of emancipation and reconstruction. This is not to argue that the only function of black criminalization is to regulate movement, or even that black criminalization only occurs through vagrancy, but it is to elucidate these connections and to further argue that black criminalization actually has very little to do with actual crime and much more to do with the conditioning of black life as an inability to fulfill the requirements set forth by whiteness. Angela Davis has illustrated that the conceptual distinctions of blacks and whites imbricated in the criminal discourse is one of criminality versus crime. Frank Wilderson III has built on this by arguing that for black people there are only two manifestations, that of the prison slave and the prison slave in waiting, which acknowledges that only criminality that is ascribed to black people, but the way in which this is in the United States, criminality is not measured by one's physical proximity to the prison, but beyond the racial comportments designated by white authority as prohibited and cause for arrest or death. As such, the prison itself does not represent a separation from a discrete before and after of criminalization. That is, punishment is not secondary, but becomes constitutive of black existence. This is both a theoretical gesture away from discipline as a response to crime as criminalization. The vagrancy laws and the black codes begin to indicate how black people are always already a threat to national security, not because they wield weapons against the Western project, quote, but for being such weapons, and thus always in need of containment, surveillance, sanction, deportation, elimination. Sexton and Lee, 2006. For black people, surveillance is constitutive, operative, anywhere and any time, not restricted to class and subsequent spatiality. The constitutive surveillance renders not only the individual, but is productive of an entire assemblage of people. As such, a crime committed by a black individual stood to obscure the entire race with a criminal shadow, not unlike how Shakur's wanted billboards were made to cast themselves over low-income neighborhoods in New Jersey. And that is the end of the first part of this essay. I'll have the second part up later today. Also today is the day that Assata Shakur has been announced dead. So rest in power to her and power to the people.